So good afternoon, I'm Carl Garth and welcome to the Champion Chat with Councillor Alison Champion. Good afternoon, Alison. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, Carl. Thank you for asking. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Well, today we revisit our series on social change and local government support by having a deeper look at diversity within the Banyule City. Now, we know that Banyule's got a rich history in diversity, but just to make things a little clear for people out there, diversity covers many forms. It not only looks at recognising, respecting and valuing differences based on ethnicity, gender, age, race, religion, but also things such as disability and sexual orientation. And there's also a range of unique characteristics and experiences such as educational background, income level, geographic location, marital status and other variables that influence personal perspectives and are seen as part of the diverse background of every human being. Joining Alison for this week's chat, we have Michelle McNamara and Councillor Rick Garotti. Welcome, Michelle and Rick. Would you like to just introduce yourselves and a little bit about your background regarding diversity, please? Michelle, would you like to go first?
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Carl. Yes, I am a transgender woman, out and proud, and I've been out publicly for 10 years now. And shortly after coming out, I joined a group called Transgender Victoria, first as volunteer, then as a committee member. I'm currently treasurer and chair their advocacy committee, which means I cover a lot of bases with Transgender Victoria. It's a small organisation. It's got 7 part-time employees at the moment, 1 full-time employee, our CEO, but it's made up of a volunteer board and many volunteers and members who all work towards the well-being of the trans and gender diverse community in Victoria. For those who don't know, a transgender person is someone who has been assigned one gender at birth and now recognizes that they are not that gender anymore. And that might be, as I am assigned male at birth, go to female, and vice versa, males to female. But the third possibility is that either assigned male or female and now don't identify with either gender. And we generally lump those together as gender diverse people, although there are lots of different names for them. Hopefully that's a little thumbnail. Going on with my history, so I joined Transgender Victoria in 2015. I talked at IDAHOBIT Day with the City of Banyule in front of the Ivanhoe Town Hall in 2016. So that was May 2016. And late in 2016, joined what was then called the LGBTI Advisory Committee, I think, now called the LGBTIQA+ Population Committee. Along the way, while I've been doing that, I was working at the University of Melbourne and was one of the inaugural staff representatives on their Pride and Action network for LGBTIQA+ people. I've worked with the GLBTIQA+ Multicultural Council. So that works for multicultural and multi-faith LGBTIQA+ people, and also done a whole variety of things, been involved with the police LGBTIQA+ advisory group, and so on, work in the areas of religion and sport and helping in advocacy in general. So that's a long-winded answer to where I got here. I retired in 2021, and now I'm focusing on Transgender Victoria, but retaining my involvement as the Transgender Victoria representative on the LGBTIQA+ population committee for the City of Banyule.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Councillor Rick, would you like to give us a little bit of your background, please?
Yeah, I don't know how I follow that.
Quite easily, Rick, I should think.
Well, I'm been on council for 12 years, and I'm our deputy mayor, and very privileged to be able to work with a range of community groups and representatives, including people like Michelle. And probably one of the most enjoyable experiences that I've had this year, and even in this council term, was the privilege of being invited to the Transgender Day of Visibility event in Rosanna. It was actually quite an emotional and touching event, quite uplifting as well, though. So we're privileged as councillors at times to be able to work with people like Michelle and work with our diverse communities, and very happy to be part of this chat today, Carl.
And Rick, if you don't mind me saying, with a name like Garotti, I would also assume there's quite a cultural background for you and your family history as part of Australia's multicultural society.
Yeah, yep. So Italian father and a Macedonian mother, married to a Persian and Muslim background, and our girls are Persian. They constantly remind me that they're Persian, not Italian, not nothing to do with dad. Okay.
So
yeah,
you've really covered all bases.
yeah, yeah. So it is. I think that multicultural background was really strengthened in terms of who I married, and I've really enjoyed engaging in that Persian culture, I must say. Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
the girls are a pizza like me.
please expand, Alison.
Pizza too. So I was born in Australia, and my mother came out in 1965 as a 10-pound Brit. So my mother's background is predominantly English and part French. And my father is he's essentially was Maltese Italian. Grew up in Alexandria in Egypt, and when I think when he was in his probably low 20s, something like that. Any person in Alexandria or Egypt at the time of post-war, so we're talking after 1945, when King Nasser took over, he got to a point he just said, unless you are an Egyptian citizen, you are to go now.
Right.
And they were British citizens, being predominantly Maltese. They were British citizens, so they were essentially kicked out of their home country. And they ended up making their way to Australia. And so, yeah, so mum and dad actually ended up meeting in Sydney as teachers. So that's my national background, my cultural background.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So can I chime in and say that I was on the GLBTIQA plus Multicultural Council, and I look like a very big ring in there. I'm as white bread as you can come. I'm at the very least fourth generation Australian born. And my family come from an Irish and Anglo-Celtic background in general. The reason I was on the GLBTIQ Multicultural Council was I belong to a minority faith, and that's the Buddhist faith. And I proudly acknowledge my Buddhist faith without proselytizing about it or promoting it. But, it is a challenge for all LGBTIQA plus people who have faiths, particularly minority faiths, to gain acceptance by the community. And even Buddhism, which sounds like a very friendly sort of diverse community, is in fact quite difficult. It's sometimes quite a difficult proposition to be in that space. And that you talked about variety of identities, Carl, in the introduction. And we each bring these intersecting identities to our lives and to the way that we live our lives. But to have minority ethnicity, minority faiths, and some other minority identity, which is marginalized in some way, such as being LGBTIQA plus, is quite an issue, because you have what's called intersectionality, which is when you get two marginalized identities interacting. So you're marginalized by your religious community, for example, because you're LGBTI, and the LGBTIQA plus community, because it's been so disparaged by the religious communities, they also marginalize people who have got a religious background. So you get it both ways, is essentially what intersectionality means. And that's an interesting point. And the council has been amazing. I think particularly recently, it has a number of these population committees. I'm just a member of one. But, for example, the council's now starting to consider aging and being LGBTI and intersectionality. And we've just started a group called the Golden Rainbow coming out of that. And that's a very valuable thing, because older LGBTIQA plus people, suffer marginalization in all sorts of other ways. And the other bit of intersectionality that we did during the voice referendum was the LGBTIQA plus population committee talked about their experiences during the marriage equality plebiscite, with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Committee talking about what they might be likely to experience during the voice referendum. And indeed, they did experience some shocking things during the voice referendum, and how they should prepare for it and cope for it. So that was an interesting conversation and something the council facilitated. So there's some marvellous work going on in the area of intersectionality within the City of Banyule Council work.
Look, all this is actually leads into probably the first question that I really wanted to ask, and that is this: that the challenge, I think, that as a society that we have today is, how do we create inclusion, equal opportunity for all, respecting the differences and allowing people the space to grow? But more importantly, how do we achieve multiculturalism where we don't see ourselves as an LGBTIQA plus Australian, or a Persian Australian, or a Indo-Australian, or an Anglo-Australian? How do we actually see ourselves as a uniquely Australian culture? We don't put those other parts in front of it. We just say we are Australian. We accept that Australia is actually this. The question I actually have to the panel is, do you actually feel that Australians know, agree, or even have a vision of what an Australian culture that we could all identify with would be? I know it's a big question to start with.
I'm happy to
Please.
kick off, but I recognise that I've had a whole lot of the floor to date, and I'm happy to sit back and let Alison or Rick comment if they want to. But I think the defining feature for me of particularly the Melbourne community at large, and I see it in other communities, but is by and large tolerance. There's an awful lot of tolerance for diversity in Australia, more so than you see elsewhere. And it is in other countries, in other societies, and it is a defining feature of Australian culture that it's accepting of diversity, it's accepting of a fair go for everybody. That's ingrained in the Australian culture, to my mind. And there's an awful lot of stuff and noise made by various people for their own political and other purposes about the non-accepting parts of our society. But by and large, I think we've seen marriage equality was a great example that plebiscite indicated that Australians were much more accepting of LGBTIQA plus people than you might have expected before. I think the voice referendum is a particularly problematical situation in which there was an incredible amount of misinformation, and there wasn't a united front by the Indigenous people, or they managed to destroy that. So, but I think that given time, we will come around to being tolerant of that particular racial difference. But I think that we, by and large, do tolerate an extraordinary range of multiculturalism and ranges of abilities, ranges of ages, all sorts of diversity.
Okay. Rick or Alison, would you like to add to that?
I've got a question that will expand on that a little bit, and it's I know it's a topic that we've covered, Michelle, in our LGBTIQA plus committee meeting. Couple of years ago, we were having the conversation around forms, filling out government forms and the tick boxes that are provided. And I remember we were in a conversation about that there weren't enough tick boxes for the person who's filling it out regarding their gender or their sexuality. So there are certain forms that we fill out, and I'm really conscious of that now. When I fill out a form, it's for someone like myself, it is actually easy just to tick female. For many more other residents, it's not that easy. because they don't identify as either, in this case, male or female. And there's usually a tick box that says other. What's other? What is that? And I agree a lot with what Michelle has said. There's a lot of tolerance on the surface. There's a lot of tolerance and acceptance. There are some questions for understanding that I certainly receive, and you know, some of my fellow councillors might as well. You know, I don't understand this. Why is this being said? Why do we need to do that? So there are those kind of questions coming out, which I'm sure we'll talk about further in the podcast. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty of telling an organisation who you are, in some cases there are not enough of the tick boxes, and there are members of our community who are going, so am I a nobody? I'm not male, I'm not female, I'm not other. What's other? That's not a gender. You know, and I'm, you know, and then there might be a question about sexuality, you know, what is that? And then you've got some tick boxes. It's like, well, I don't identify as two of those tick boxes. So does that mean this form doesn't you know, I don't relate to this, I'm not included? So that's an example of where the diversity isn't as understood in order to create that form to then achieve whatever outcome needs to be achieved. So
Great.
there are some finer points that still need thought and conversation and knowledge.
Yeah, no, I think very good feedback from Michelle and Alison. I think that question that you've asked, Carl, is probably, I think, the big question of our time, because I think it's been vitally important, you know, for example, at the council level, that we've set up these population different committees and to give a voice for the LGBTIQ, multicultural. We've got an Aboriginal advisory committee, a disability advisory committee.
Age friendly as well.
But I feel age friendly, but I feel too that there's this, we're almost segmenting people. What category are you in? Are you LGBTIQ? Are you Indigenous? Are you disability? And then there's obviously cross sections. And Michelle touched on the intersectionality earlier. But in terms of having something that we all 100% of Australians identify with and embrace. You know, we're in that process, I think, as a country, working through that. I think that council does really well in giving a voice to people who may have not had a voice in the past, and I think that's vitally important. But I think too, we do well in terms of doing a range of events and opportunities that just bring everyone together. You know, the Queer Street Festival, as an example, is a really good example of that. Obviously, that's an event that's catered toward giving a voice and celebrating and honouring the LGBTIQ plus community, but everyone attends it within Banyule, and everyone enjoys it and participates in it and comes away, you know, feeling energised and enthused. So I think our council role is to continue to give a voice and to hear and be advocates, but then also look at those opportunities about how we bring everyone together and invite the conversation around what it means to be Australian. But I do think it's really vitally important in these times where there's a tendency for us to want to split off into groups, that we realise that we are one country, and we've got our faults, no doubt, and we've got our challenges, but there's a lot to be proud of as well. So I don't think there's an answer. It's a process. And full credit to Alison and yourself for even doing this, because it's a very challenging topic. This sort of conversation is part of that, Carl.
Thank you, Rick. Michelle, would you like to maybe provide a little bit more detail around that last bit that Rick was talking about?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on two things, pick up on what Alison said, but first talk in general again about Rick's comment. I agree things are changing in society in Australia fairly rapidly in areas of inclusion across all sorts of diversities. But in terms of ethnic diversity, I cast my mind back to when my ancestors first came to this country, largely all from Ireland, and they came and settled during the gold rush. And that was an extraordinary period of social change. And the diversity in Australian society, you had Italians came, when you look at the Eureka Stockade, it had Italians, it had Americans, there were Chinese around. And it was an extraordinarily volatile period in Australian history where we were forming the nascent Australian culture, if you like. And I think that process is still going on today. But when we looked at how badly various groups who did settle here were treated at the time, such as the Chinese, one sees some echoes of that during the recent COVID pandemic, but nowhere near the violence and the incredible xenophobia that existed back in the gold rush era, and which continued on into the White Australia policy. And we've only just come out of the White Australia policy in my lifetime. It was still around until the early 70s. And so we are at a point in time where I think we're evolving to a much better situation in terms of tolerance of ethnicity differences, but also, differences based on gender, sexuality, gender identity, and a whole range of disabilities and age, and all of the things that have been mentioned, and all of the things that council is commendably tackling. It's a great thing.
Yeah.
Just to comment on the specificity of the gender. Oh, sorry, just the one more point about the incorporation of different ethnicities. My personal experience, my son used to play soccer, and he played across a whole lot of different clubs for various reasons, mainly because his mates kept moving. And so he played with East Richmond, Benito, and Clifton Hill. And East Richmond was very English-based, Anglo guys, some of whom had played within the English Premier League. There was Italians. The Benito Club is very Italian-based, and beautiful coffee on Saturday morning, most welcome. But they're very culturally Italian. And then you go to Clifton Hill, and it's very, very Greek. But when you look at the adults there that form the basis of the club, they're all very associated with different ethnic groups, with those three different ethnic groups. When you look at the children that my son was playing with, they identify as Aussies. They're speaking in the Australian vernacular, and they're behaving like Australian kids. So it's very, the culture of communities is very quick to adapt to some sort of new Australian ethos, which I think is quite interesting. I'm not sure where it's heading, but these kids would bring something of their food, something of their ethnic background, something of their thinking into their Australianness, but there still is something definably Australian about them, I think. So
that's probably actually a fairly good summary, in that, like many things, over time and generations, they become, I don't want to use the word assimilated, but they become more familiar with the surroundings, the vernaculars, and various other differences that they then bring their unique part to. So you are right. I used to coach junior basketball, and you see that the children will actually, the way they communicate is actually different to the way their parents communicate. And that's not just an age thing, that's actually a linguistical difference. So I think that's actually a good point, Michelle, is over time, we will see even more, oh God, I don't want to use this term, but it's probably the only term I can think of. I want to say homogenisation, but more of a singular Australian identity that encompasses all. And
Yeah,
I think,
sorry. The thing that occurred to me is that the Chinese community in Bendigo typifies this, and they're almost a case study in this because
well, I'm actually from Bendigo, so
yeah, they're identifiably Aussies, but they're also identifiably Chinese, and they maintain their culture beautifully up there. It's an
absolutely
extraordinary thing to have happened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I grew up in Bendigo, the Chinese are absolutely intrinsic and probably celebrated a lot more now than what they were when I was growing up as a child.
Yes.
So
But I think one thing too, Carl, that we can reflect on and in a positive way is I just remember seeing ads as a kid, Holden ads
yes.
around what it means to be Australian, and I think you had the kangaroos,
Yeah, meat pies.
pie, football,
Yes.
and a Holden car. And look, in some ways, there was something quite nice about the fact that you could simplify our culture down to the fact that we all embrace those things. But the reality is that we're so much more complex and diverse than that.
Absolutely.
And I think part of it is celebrating that diversity, but then finding a few hooks to say, well, there are still a few things that we can all get together around.
And look, I'm often asked, so I'll have either residents give me a call or an email. In our banner, we've sometimes put in the flag, so we put in the Australian flag, and we have obviously on flagpoles around Banyule as well. So we have the traditionally Australian flag, we have the Torres Strait Islander flag, we have the Aboriginal flag, and that's actually a requirement by federal government. And then the fourth flagpole is for more local government or community groups. So we've certainly put those in print in the banner. And one particular edition, I had some residents ring me. I think they also rang some of my fellow councillors. Alison, there's a coloured flag. I think it's an LGBTIQA plus flag there next to the Australian flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag. I thought we were all Australian, so wouldn't we just have the one Australian flag? What's the answer to that?
Yes, we will get we will get so many different answers on that one, Alison.
Yeah.
And I think probably we might move on from that one at the moment. I would like to thank the four of you for having the courage to actually have a go at that first question. It is a big question, and it probably leads me into the next one. We know that Banyule are doing so many things to try and overcome these challenges. I know, and we know that a lot of what is happening is also integrated back at state and federal level, as you already alluded to. But I guess one of the other questions too is that there sometimes, fairly or unfairly, there are accusations of institutional or a bias. And what is it that you feel that in Banyule we're doing to make sure we're trying to identify and address any perceptions around bias, real or perceived?
Look, I'm happy to start on that one, and then it'd be good to hear Michelle as well from an external perspective. But I think, one of the things that we have done as councillors is that we've asked the question of our CEO. And I know that when I first got elected to council, I don't think we had one single person who was of Aboriginal background or heritage employed in the council.
Wow.
We did not have one single person who was of a Somali African background, despite how sizable that community is in Heidelberg West. We didn't even have any understanding or visibility of people with disabilities and people from our LGBTIQ plus community. If I fast forward now, 12 years on from that, we've created all of these advisory committees that have just elevated the role and importance and understanding and voice for those communities. Two, we've really committed organisationally toward diversity. One, to understanding where we're at, to monitoring and tracking, and to being accountable for that. And now, you know, we've got some talented officers across all those diverse parts of our community that we didn't have 12 years ago. And I would say our council is better and stronger for it. We're enormously we're terrifically well run, terrifically well administered. And I think a big part of that is because we've embraced that diversity and we've broken down some of those barriers. Is it perfect? No. There's a lot of work to be done, Carl. And, you know, but are we heading in the right direction? I would like to think we are. But, you know, that's probably for people like Michelle and others to comment on.
Michelle, would you like to have?
Yeah, certainly. I haven't been around Banyule as long as Rick has, but I've been around for 8 years in terms of being an LGBTIQA plus in person involved with what council does. I think that, and this is partly addressing Alison's comment, you know, the importance of what they're doing in terms of asking community and giving communities voice, marginalized communities, giving them communities voice is incredibly important. You know, if you're a cis white heterosexual male who is fully abled and I can't think of what else, but you know, fully Aussie, full Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Celtic background, you don't really need to have a flag. You've got the flag, you've got the Australian flag, and that's something to be proud of. But if you're from a marginalised community where it was illegal as recently as 2000 to be a firm male at birth and wear women's clothing in Hobart, that's 2000. And in 1997, it was illegal for you to have as a man, if you were a man, to have sexual relations with another man in Tasmania. That's incredibly recent. That's not in dim dark past. It's incredibly recent, and the amount of disparagement of people of different ethnic backgrounds, people with disabilities, people with people with of Aboriginal descent, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent is extraordinary. But, you know, my own community, the trans and gender diverse community, there was a publication last year called Fueling Hate, which just describes how incredibly frequent it is that we as a trans and gender diverse community encounter hate out in the community. And it's important to counter that. So I think to go back to what council is doing from my perspective, I think there was a report called Out at Work, which was published in 2018. It was a survey of something like 2,000 LGBTIQA plus people about their workplaces. And they were asked, you know, were they prepared to be out at work? And an incredible percentage, more than half, were not prepared to be out in any way at work. And particularly bad if you were trans and gender diverse. You know, there are people very unwilling to be out at work. And the other side of it was the people who were out at work, they were asked about the characteristics of their organisation, which enabled them to be out at work. And there were 4. And obviously policies and procedures that support that minority, that LGBTIQA plus community are incredibly important. And that is something that we do address on the advisory committee, the LGBTIQA plus advisory committee. And I imagine in other committees, particularly disability and, you know, aged and so on, but certainly can speak to the LGBTIQA plus population advisory committee. So the policies and procedures are important, but even more important is to have a leadership that supports those that community, so the LGBTIQA plus community. And we've certainly seen in the years that I've been involved with that committee, it has been chaired by the mayor. And that is the kind of, to me, says the ultimate leadership. It's also had very strong support from the whole of all the council officers And that's so important. The next one that I'm a little bit unsure of in council is that you have people of the diversity, these in this case LGBTIQA+, within the employment group who identify as LGBTIQA+, and who are prepared to be out, you know, and that's very important to see leaders who are like you leading the workplace. And the third one is you celebrate that identity, being LGBTIQA+. And the reason for celebrating a marginalized community is because, you know, and going back, it was illegal for most of my life to be who I was, for example, in Tasmania, and it's been very uncomfortable to be that way in Victoria for quite some time, and illegal up till 82 to be a man who was having sex with men. And not that I'm saying that I did, but you know, if you were, then you were really disparaged. And during the AIDS crisis, the gay men were shockingly treated.
Yep.
And you know, celebrating that identity by raising the flag on the flagpole on selected celebratory days, and by having events like Queer Street, and by having events like the We Are exhibition that's going to be held, launched on IDAHOBIT Day next Friday at the Ivanhoe Library, by having the library have displays of LGBTIQA+ books. It's called Queer Here and Now or something like that in the library. Having those components of celebrating the LGBTIQA+ identity is incredibly important. So they're the four components, and I'd certainly see a big tick for three of them. I know that there's been an LGBTIQA+ network set up within the staff at Banyule Council. So I think there's probably even a tick on that third one. It's just I'm not that familiar with it. But you can apply those, well, those principles are not just for the people within the organization themselves, but they talk to how, and when this is examined, how those people deliver their service to their clients, to their customers, to people they work for and with, and how they work together to do that. And that's improved by having those four components working together. So I think that's my personal kind of mud map for how to go about being more diverse and being more accepting of diversity. And I think Banyule displays it very well. And I think the one thing I really love about Banyule is that diversity statement. It's a magnificent thing to be read out at the start of each council meeting and each and council employee meeting and each advisory group meeting, to read out a statement that says that the City of Banyule supports all these different diversities. That's wonderful.
Look, I think very good thing there is setting a right vision, having a leadership that sets a vision and a culture, and then having the rest of the people buy into that. Once you getting past that first part is really hard, but once you've got that vision and that culture and you're getting people to buy into it, that's the start of your journey. And I think it's good to hear from you the experience you've had working with Banyule as part of that journey that Banyule City has been on as well.
Can I just add one more thing, Carl?
Yes.
One thing that really inspired me is and this came about through my involvement in the Australian GLBTIQ Multicultural Council. We used to go every year to the Malahang, was it Malahang or Malahang Festival, and be there, and that's a very multicultural and very disadvantaged part of the city of Banyule, and that's a wonderful thing to be able to display being LGBTIQA+ and what it means to that community. But the city of Banyule did a whole lot of events at that festival, which I think is magnificent. And the other thing I think that was wonderful that council did in that area of ethnic and racial diversity was set up the Harmony Centre in the mall in West Heidelberg to enable, and it's a beautiful centre. It has offices, it has meeting rooms, and council can now provide and go into that centre and provide services to that community right in the heart of that community. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing that I've observed in Banyule. Yeah.
Look, I'd like to sort of move us along a little bit. There is one question that we're leading into at the moment, and this has had quite a bit of focus just recently. And this question is around, recently we've seen protests from certain ethnic groups and cultural groups to government at all levels, at local, state and federal. And these protests are actually almost isolating other ethnic groups. And there's been a bit of almost an accusation that are we moving from multiculturalism to multi-tribalism? And I'd like to get each of you your opinions of, are we seeing this multi-tribalism coming out because we're trying to address many concerns at individual group levels, and sometimes that's at the expense of the wider community? Rick, would you like to start us off on that one?
Yeah. Carl, you do realise that Alison and I we're local councillors. We're not the Prime Minister, and
no, I understand that.
So, because this is very, very big picture questions that you're asking, and I suppose I'll always then just bring it back to what's in our patch at a local council level.
Absolutely.
We've had some, I wouldn't say challenges, but obviously with the issues and challenges happening in the Middle East at the moment, we've had some protests from concerned community members outside of the council, the chambers, for a few meetings. What I would say is that council becomes where people don't feel they have a voice with federal or state, where they're not getting traction with a federal member, where then or state, we become the last resort, the last level of government, the last place in a way where people can feel they have their say. And even though these issues might be well beyond our remit, I think that's really important. I think it's really important that people can feel that they can come to council, and I must say the protests that happened were very peaceful outside. They were non-violent, and we have to encourage that as a council. On a personal level, I might have had some disagreements with the basis of those protests, but I fully applaud the way that they occurred. And I fully applaud the way that they were peaceful and constructive. And that's our role as a council. Our role is to facilitate that and to facilitate dialogue and discussion. And I come back again then because with the challenges of social media, the challenges of there is increasing tribalism. Previously, for example, in accessing news, there was a couple of, radio, TV, news. There's a couple of centralised places where people would get their news. That's not the case anymore now.
Yeah.
So we're grappling with all of these different trends. And I think that as a council, we need to be the place where anyone can feel they can come and have a voice. And we also have this critical role of continuing to do things that just bring people together, our events, our festivals, our different things. Because I think when people come together, and I think when people realise that, hang on a tick, that person from that community is probably not that different to me. And now that I've met them and I've eyeballed them, I actually can sympathise with where we're coming from. It is so critical a role that we have. And I think, if anything, what this conversation is probably prompting for me, Carl, is to say, as a council, do we need to strengthen that going forward? Do we need to really increase on that, those opportunities of just bringing people together and cultivating that shared understanding? Because I dare I say is that it's very hard to have a prejudiced view, or very hard to have you know, a negative view when you've met with someone. And what I would say, for example, is to the people in, you know, not to make this conversation today just about LGBTIQ, but obviously our guest is from that community, but we know that there are people in our community that are prejudiced against LGBTIQ plus. And I just sort of feel that if those people in that community had have come along to the Transgender Day Visibility event that I attended, or came along to the Queer Street, I know their views would change.
Yep.
And I know that they would see other humans and other people that they could connect with that are there. So I think in these very challenging times, we just need to do more of what we're doing, and we need to be the conduit of bringing people together. I suppose that's my take on it from what we can do at a council level.
And I'd concur with that. All those events that we as a council create for our diversity within our council group. So every year we have a variety of events in each calendar month. You know, we've just touched on IDAHOBIT Day. So IDAHOBIT Day being Friday, the 17th of May. There's an event. We have Youth Fest, which is a great event. You don't have to be young to go to it. You can just show up. It's in Park. It's in McLeod Park. You just show up, you know, but it celebrates and acknowledges our young people, sort of the 12 to 25-year-olds. There are a couple of really good examples. There are other examples of events and activities and celebrations that we create in Banyule for the benefit of bringing people together and acknowledging certain characteristics about each of our communities. You know what, you know, Rick made the point, and Carl, we have this in our, you know, in our BNI groups, in our business networking groups. We have, you know, the one-to-ones, and when we get together in a one-to-one, so a little meeting with one other member, it's an opportunity to get to know each other on a more detailed or personal level rather than a high level, so that you find a way to connect somehow, some way, which may not have anything to do with our business. It may not have anything to do with the event at which we're attending, but there may be some little thing that connects both of us, and we go, oh, wow, we have something in common. Oh, that's awesome. And it goes from there. So that leads to that respect and appreciation, maybe tolerance, which is better than not being tolerant, from a prejudice point of view. Yeah. So that's where, bring people together to allow for those conversations, to find a connection, as small as the connection might be, to then create something better and bigger.
Look, well answered, and Rick, thank you for such a very, that was a very compassionate and well-reasoned response. So thank you for that. Michelle, you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess just on the tribalism versus multiculturalism, I'd go back to my gold rush example earlier, you know, and the Chinese community in Bendigo are a great example. You know, they were subject of some massacres during the gold rush era by other gold miners, and you know, today they quite happily march in the Easter parade. They display their wonderful dragon in the Easter parade, and they're a central feature of the Bendigo Easter parade now. And I think just we will have lumps and bumps on the way to a multicultural society, and there will be moments when there will be tribalism and when people will identify with their tribes, but I'm still massively optimistic that we will move on from that situation to a more cohesive society. Maybe misguided optimism, but optimism nevertheless. I think to go back to the points that were being made about the need to bring people together, I would just, you know, reflect on my situation, the trans and gender diverse community. There was a study done in 2016 by the Williams Institute, which is at the UCLA Law School, and they did a 23-nation study, 1,000 people in each nation, each country, and just drawn at random from the general population. And they asked each of these people, you know, various questions on trans and gender diverse people having rights, the right to change their birth certificate, the right to be accepted in society, you know, all these, and right to marry, all those sort of rights. And the biggest predictor for whether someone accepted a trans and gender diverse person as having rights was, did they actually know, had they actually met a trans and gender diverse person in real life? Were they friends? Were they family? Were they workmates? Did they know them? And once you know another person as a human being, it's really hard to be prejudiced against them. It's possible, but it's a lot harder.
And that was the point I think Rick was saying earlier. Once you put a human face, you realise the differences aren't that much. Absolutely. Look, I know we're getting very close to running out of time. One of the things I would like to ask is, obviously, Banyule is very proud of all the effort and all the work they do, and obviously it does come at a cost, but also how can groups or individuals seeking support engage with council to become part of the solution moving forward, or to have that recognition of their culture that they're looking to gain support from?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, well, number one, Carl, the elections are coming up. So, you know, being an incumbent, I don't really want to promote people to run, but they should. Because people from our different communities, if they should feel empowered to put their hand up for a leadership position. So to be honest, that's probably the first thing to have a look at. If you're part of the community and you think that you've got something to contribute, put your hand up. And I'm more than happy to sit down. I know Alison is as well, and give us our advice. We're not the right people to serve the community going forward, and other people are. We have a duty to pass on our advice. So that's the first thing I'd say, Carl. The second thing is that there's a lot of structured processes of council for engagement. So there's all of our population advisory committees, and I'd encourage the community to look at them and get involved. The third thing is that at the start of every council term, and we're gearing up for this, we get a citizens collective together to do our strategic plan and our visioning and all our plans. And we're currently recruiting for that at the moment as a councillor. So I would say that's third. The fourth is you've got 9 councillors, you've got officers, we've got meetings every 3 weeks. Just come and talk to us and come and approach us. That's a big part of our job, is just to hear and meet and engage new communities. So I think there's a lot of touch points there that I've outlined that hopefully people can say, okay, well, I might look at that, or I might look at that. You know, but that probably one of the most important things we do is being that open door. And because like I said earlier, Carl, you know, at the state level, at the federal level, when they're dealing with really challenging agencies, we need to be the level of government that is open for people, and there's no barrier to that openness. So I would just say, if in doubt, give us a ring.
Okay. Alison, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, look, yes, absolutely. So that there are definitely some things that you are able to do. I would say you are responsible for doing, rather than complaining. It's do exactly what Councillor Rick has just said. I would add that what we can do to help. So Rick talked about ringing us, having a conversation with us. One of our roles is to connect community with council officers who are specialised in various fields. In this case, we would connect you with certainly either the Director of Community Wellbeing or one of the managers of one of the departments to discuss further any questions or queries or concerns that one has. Just even if they just want to get an answer for something, that's possible. And keeping an eye out as well. Obviously, you know, we do refer to our website. There are certain programs, activities, etc., that are advertised on our website. It's a good idea to just keep an eye on that. And another thing too, which I know probably isn't quite as exciting, is just looking at the agenda of a council meeting before the meeting is held, and just go, oh, is there anything in there that interests me or that I might find an answer to? And that's always advertised 5 days before a council meeting. So, or if you can't make it to see the meeting, it's online and recorded, and the minutes are produced and put out about 3 days after the meeting. So there are places, there's standard council places, media places to go to and see, or as well as contact us, and we connect you with council officers.
Okay, thank you. Look, that pretty much wraps up our available time today. So first of all, I'd like to thank Alison, Michelle and Rick for all of your insights in that today. It's been fantastic, and I thank you for your courage.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. And thank you very much, Michelle and Rick, for joining us. I really appreciate your input as well. This is great. Thank you.
And
Thank you, Alison. Carl.
Thanks, Carl. Lovely to see you, Michelle.
Yeah, great to see you, Rick, too.
And for all of you watching the podcast, I hope that Michelle, Rick and Alison have given you some valuable insight, and even maybe some help in understanding where you may be able to go and get support from Banyule City. There will be links below in the copy underneath this podcast that enable you to get in touch with your local councillor. Thank you very much for watching the podcast, and we'll see you all next month.